Hello, Spence here. We're carrying on our series in the book of Ezra. So far, as I say every week, we've seen that the people of God, they were in exile for 70 years, but God has graciously moved so they can return to the land. And what was their big point? What was the main aim of them returning? It was to build the temple, to rebuild the place where they can meet with God. And today we get to the high point of the whole story in Ezra so far, because they finished the temple. The temple is done. And we see that their response is one of joy. They kind of burst out with excitement and with joy. Because remember, it's been hard work getting this temple done. Sweat has been dropping down their faces, tears probably, certainly opposition. And many times it looked like it was never going to get done, but now it's finished and they are bursting with joy. And as we approach the text, I want us to be thinking of a couple of questions. First, I want us, if we're Christians, to look back and think, have we lost sight of the excitement, of the joy we had when we first came to Jesus? When we first come to know Jesus, we are full of wonder at the fact that God would forgive us and we can come to know him. But we can lose sight of that. And I hope, and my prayer is that this passage will rekindle our joy and excitement of who we are because we know Jesus. And if you're not a Christian, you're listening in, very welcome to join us. And I hope that this passage shows you the joy of coming to know Jesus. Let me pray and then I'll get into the text. Father, I pray thanks for this text that you are speaking to us through it. Please do show us the joy of coming to know Jesus, that as we come to know Jesus, we receive relationship with you, forgiveness. We have a mediator, a priest that is for us, and we can celebrate that we have been saved. Lord, open our eyes and rekindle our joy. Amen. Now let me read from Ezra 6, from verse 13 through to the end of the chapter. Then, because of the decree King Darius had sent, Tattenai, governor of the Trans-Euphrates, and Shethar-bozenai and their associates carried it out with diligence. So the elders of the Jews continued to build and prosper under the preaching of Haggai the prophet and Zechariah, a descendant of Iddo. They finished building the temple according to the command of the God of Israel and the decrees of Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes, kings of Persia. The temple was completed on the 3rd day of the month of Adar, in the 6th year of the reign of King Darius. Then the people of Israel, the priests, the Levites, and the rest of the exiles celebrated the dedication of the house of God with joy. For the dedication of this house, they offered 100 bulls, 200 rams, 400 male lambs, and, as a sin offering for all Israel, 12 male goats, one for each of the tribes of Israel. And they installed the priests in their divisions and the Levites in their groups for the service of God at Jerusalem, according to what is written in the book of Moses. On the 14th day of the first month, the exiles celebrated the Passover. The priests and Levites had purified themselves and were all ceremonially clean. The priests slaughtered the Passover lamb for all the exiles, for their relatives, the priests, and for themselves. So the Israelites who had returned from the exile ate it, together with all who had separated themselves from the unclean practices of their Gentile neighbours, in order to seek the Lord, the God of Israel. For 7 days they celebrated with joy the festival of unleavened bread, because the Lord had filled them with joy, by changing the attitude of the kings of Assyria. So he assisted them in the work of the house of God, the God of Israel. So if you remember last week, we saw that there was opposition. That Tattenai and Shethar-bozenai, what a name, they came and they asked some questions, didn't they? They said, who's given you the authority to build this temple, and what are your names? And they went off to the king, and basically thinking they were going to stop the work. But God worked in the king, and the king said, no, let them continue. And in fact, give them all the resources, give them the stuff they need for sacrifices. And here in verse 13, we see that they carried it out with diligence. And in response to that, verse 14, the elders of the Jews, they continued to build and to prosper under the preaching of the prophet. And what happened? The temple is finished. It's done. They've actually finished the work. And they mentions it twice in the passage. They've finished building the temple, verse 15, the temple was completed. It's emphasising this because just think what it was like for those people that were there. They were in exile for 70 years. While they were there, they'd have thought there was no way they would ever see this happen. No way they'd ever have a temple where they could meet with God again. But it's finished. And then they return and they see the rubble on the ground. There's no way we're going to meet with God again. Look at this rubble. But now it's finished. And then they get opposition and they stopped. Do you remember they stopped building for a long time? And they would have thought, oh, this is never going to happen. But now it is finished. Just think of what we're like as humans. How many of us at the beginning of lockdown were like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to learn to play the flute and the trombone. I'll speak French and Japanese by the end of the lockdown. Oh, and how many of us have done that? I bet not very many. We're so good at making plans and we so often don't follow through with them. And that's what happened with these people. You kind of look back at the story in Ezra and we see that there are so many times when it just looked like it was never going to happen. But God ensured that it did get finished. Verse 14, we see that they finished the temple according to the command of the God of Israel and the decrees of Cyrus and Darius. We see that God made sure that this temple was finished. God made sure that there was a way where the people could meet with him again. God did it, and he did it through various means of stirring the hearts of the people, even stirring the hearts of these foreign kings. It's like there is now a bridge between the people of God and God himself. They can meet. And it was God that ensured that bridge would be there. What do they do? Well, a bit like, I guess, how we do when we finish a building. Tottenham Hotspur Stadium, that's a football stadium for those of you that don't know. They finished building it last year. It's a wonderful building, and I imagine what they did is they got a massive ribbon, usually red, isn't it? And somebody cut the ribbon in this ceremony where there was joy and excitement. And what's the thing you want to do? Well, I imagine they walked into the stadium and they wanted to see what happens in this stadium. They would have tried out the heated seats and the restaurant, and they'd have seen how the pitch moves in this awe and excitement of what there is. I think that's kind of a little hint of what's going on here in this passage. Verse 16, the rest of the exiles, they celebrated the dedication of the house of God with joy. So they cut the ribbon, as it were, of this temple, and they see what is available, what is possible in this temple. And there's joy. There's celebration. It's kind of overwhelming joy. And that we see here in the rest of the passage 4 things that give them reason for this joy. 4 things that mean the people of God can now meet with him, and it fills them with joy. First thing we see is that to come to the finished temple, they get the joy of relationship with God. Verse 17 says, the dedication of this house of God, they offered 100 bulls, 200 rams, 400 male lambs. Now, we need a bit of background to figure out what's going on here. In the Bible, there's loads of different offerings in the Old Testament that you can do. They've all been replaced now, but in the Old Testament there were these offerings, and there was sin offerings, burnt offerings, grain offerings, and fellowship, or peace offerings. And that's what's going on here, and it's important for us to know that for a few reasons. One is a fellowship offering was one that was free will. They didn't have to do it. They weren't obliged to give these offerings to God, but they are pleased to do it. And the reason they're pleased to do it is because they are giving overwhelming thanks to God for the relationship, the fellowship they now have with him. The word fellowship offering is translated as like peace or wholeness. It's expressing a wholeness of relationship that they now have with God. And they happily bring these animals and say, thank you, God, that we now know you and have relationship again. And here's an interesting thing that is about these free will offerings. All the other offerings you gave to the priest and they burnt them as offerings. Sometimes the priest would have some of the meat from the animals, but Never the people would get the meat back themselves. But this free will offering, this fellowship offering, they'd give it to the priest, and actually they'd get some of the meat back, and they could eat it. It's like this picture of having a meal with God. They offer up the sacrifice, and they get to eat some of this offering for themselves. Having a meal with God. This joy of coming back to know him. Remember, they'd been away from God for so long. So long. It's like a reunion with a family member, full of joy and excitement, seeing what they've been missing. And for us now, many of us feel lonely at times, or like we're not really known by anyone. We can come to God and be fully known, fully loved by our Maker. Just think, if you're a Christian, think of the first time that you prayed, and you weren't just saying words that were bouncing off the ceiling, but the first time you realised, I'm speaking to God, and he hears me. I'm actually talking to the God that made me, and he's hearing my voice. I have a relationship with him. I get to talk to him. Didn't that fill you with joy and excitement? When we come and have a relationship with God, it fills us with joy. And second, we see that they come to the finished temple and they get joy from forgiveness. Verse 17, it carries on and says, and as a sin offering for all Israel, 12 male goats, one for each of the tribes of Israel. So here, they cut the ribbon of the temple, and what do they find inside? What's available to them in this temple? Is forgiveness. They're able to have forgiveness. Their sin is washed away. They are clean. And remember who they are. These are the people that rejected God and were in exile. God time and time again sent them prophets to say, no, don't turn your back on me. Come back. I'll accept you. And they refused, and eventually they were sent away into exile. And even as they came back and as they were building this temple, they stopped with opposition and they built their own houses instead. They didn't want to go God's ways. They rejected him and his laws, and they wanted to live for themselves. And now, with the temple open again, with the way to meet God, they can have forgiveness. They have a sin offering. Their sin is wiped away. And notice here it's that there are 12 male goats, one for each of the tribes of Israel. Now this is a bit weird because there's actually only 2 tribes represented here. You've got Judah and Benjamin here, not the 12 tribes. Only 2 returned. So why is it mentioning the 12? Well, I think it's a sense of this is a restoration of the true Israel. Those exiles, they now come to represent all of the tribes of Israel. It's a restoration saying you are now the true Israel, the true people of God. Imagine the joy. They have forgiveness and they have restoration. Many of us have things in our past and they weigh heavy on us. Things we've done, things we've thought, things we've said. They haunt us. They are like a heavy weight on our back that physically weigh us down sometimes. When we come to God, we can have forgiveness. That weight is lifted. Christian, if you know this, you know the experience of when you first realized that I can come to God and in his grace he lifts that weight from me. Some of us will even know there was like that almost a physical lifting of joy of the burden of our sin. And it was gone, washed away. We were suddenly considered clean in his sight. And do you remember when that first moment when you realised that's what God had done? And again, just joy bursting out of us. I'm forgiven. Forgiven. Forgiveness brings us joy. Thirdly, we see that they come to the finished temple for the joy of a priest, of a mediator. Verse 18, so they cut the ribbon, they've come into the temple, they've seen the offerings, and now we see that they install priests in their divisions, and Levites in their groups for the service of God at Jerusalem, according to what is written in the book of Moses. So they've put priests in place, and they've given them the different jobs that they need to have. You're going to be in charge of these offerings. You're going to make sure the singing's done right. I think they're doing this because, in part because they're told to by the book of Moses. They want to do things right. They want to do what God says. But also because it ensures that sacrifices, that offerings can still be given into the future. They know their past, and they know that there will be ongoing sins that they have to deal with. And they're installing these priests so that they can continue to offer sacrifices into the future. The joy of not just knowing your past sin is forgiven, but knowing that there is a system of dealing with your ongoing sin struggles, ongoing things that you do wrong. And when we come to Jesus, we know that our sin is forgiven, but also that Jesus' sacrifice is enough for us into the future. Remember the joy of knowing that nothing can separate us from God, not our past, not our present, and not our future. It brings us joy. And then lastly, they come to the finished temple for the joy of celebration. In verse 19 through to the end, 22, the people of God, they celebrate the Passover. And the Passover, if you remember, it's a meal that reminds the people of God that in the past God rescued them from Egypt. They were under the Pharaoh, and God said through Moses, "Let my people go," and time after time he said no, but eventually through the Passover lamb, and then they are freed into the wilderness and ultimately into the land, free to worship God, free to know God. They celebrate the saving work he did. And here we get two groups of people that are eating this meal, and they celebrate that not just did God save people in the past, but he saved people now in the present. The first group are the exiles. So verse 21, so the Israelites who had returned from exile ate it. And I think as they're eating this meal, as they're tasting the lamb, they are remembering God saved his people in the past so that he could be with them. And they're going, but look, he's done it again. He saved us from exile, and now we're by the temple and we can celebrate that we're with God again. God saves in the past, and this Passover meal, this lamb I am eating to remind me that God has saved me, I'm having it again. And then secondly, and almost more excitingly, you get that they're eating this meal, the returned exiles ate it together with all who had separated themselves from the unclean practices of their Gentile neighbours, in order to seek the Lord, the God of Israel. So you see that not only does God save the backslidden Israelites, but it was always his plan that Israel, the people of God, that they would attract all the nations. From every tribe, from every tongue, from every race, that they would see Israel and they would come in and they would come to know God too. And as they've been rebuilding the temple, they've done that. They've seen people who have separated themselves from their Gentile ways, and they have come to seek the Lord. They have come to know him. And as these people, they are taking the lamb and they're sharing this meal and they're celebrating, look what God did to the people all those years ago, saving them from Egypt. And they're going, he's done it again. He saved us from our past ways and we now know God. Celebrate that God is the God who saves. And we do the same. We realise that God is the one who saves us. We remember that we are a saved people, and it brings us joy. But how does this relate to us? Because we don't have a temple. The Causeway Church building down the road is not a temple, okay? It's just a building that we meet in. So how do we get the joy of knowing God, of having a relationship with him, of forgiveness, of a priest and mediator who stands in between us and God, making the way through? How do you know the joy of celebrating that we're saved? Because the temple's been knocked down. 70 years after Jesus died, it was knocked down. But we know the joy because we come to the true and the better temple. We come to Jesus. Jesus described himself as the temple in John 2. Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple," talk about the very temple that these people built. "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it up again in 3 days." And then he goes on to explain, but the temple he had spoken of was his body. Jesus is now the temple. As they came to the temple, we now go to Jesus. And that's even better. Just as the joy of them knowing that the temple was finished, the way to God was complete, well, we now come to the better temple. We come to Jesus and know that it is done. That our way to God is open and finished and complete because Jesus on the cross declared his work finished when he cried out, "It is finished." The way is open. He has done it all. And we come to Jesus and we know the joy of relationship with God. We come to Jesus as the way of knowing God, of knowing his love, knowing that we are valued and that we can one day eat with Jesus himself. We come to Jesus and we know the joy of forgiveness, knowing that he took our sin on the cross, that he was the sacrifice for us. He was the offering, the sin offering, that meant we could be free, we could be clean, and we could be saved. That weight that weighed us down is gone because of Jesus. And we come to Jesus and know the joy that he is our priest. He is our mediator, the way that we go through to get to God. And we come to Jesus and know the joy, the celebration that we've been saved. That just as God saved people from Egypt, just as God saved the people from exile, even more than that, we celebrate that God has saved us from our sin. We get to know him, know his forgiveness. And as we end, I want to end with 2 questions. First is, if you're not a Christian, I'm so pleased that you are listening to this, that you're reading the Bible. And can I plead with you, come to know Jesus and know the joy of knowing him. You can come to him and receive forgiveness. You can receive the celebration of being saved, and more than anything, you come to know the joy of knowing God. Please let me ask you to pray to God and seek forgiveness. Talk to a friend you know that's a Christian and ask them, how do I get going on the Christian life? They'd be very happy to talk to you, really would. And if you're a Christian, I think there are times when we lose sight of the wonder and the joy that God has shown us. We become Christians and we're all excited and full of joy at the forgiveness and the relationship we have, that we can pray to him. And time wears on and we fail to realise what we have. Joy is sapped from us. We lose sight of our first love. Well, look at verse 22. For 7 days they celebrated with joy the festival of unleavened bread, because the Lord had filled them with joy. It's the Lord that fills us with joy. So if you have heard some of these things about forgiveness and relationship and our mediator, our priest, and you go, I've heard all that before, then run to God and ask him and say, fill me with the joy I first had. Fill me with the amazement that I really do have these things and they are wonderful. Ask him and he will fill you with joy. Now let me pray. Father, thank you for Jesus, our true and better temple. Thank you that through him we can come to know you. We have relationship with you, that I can pray to you right now, and my prayers are not just words, but I'm talking to you, the alive and living God, who loves to hear our prayers and answers our prayers. Father, I thank you that through Jesus we have relationship with you, we have forgiveness of our sin, that Jesus is our great high priest, and that we can celebrate that we are saved. Lord, help us to realise what we have. Help us to realise that we have you. Help us to realise that we get to know Jesus, our Saviour, and our Lord. Amen.